Welcome back to True Crime Threads, where real crimes unravel, one twisted thread at a time. Today, we dive into the chilling story of a bride-to-be who thought poison could buy her freedom. Sarah Miller, a 28-year-old wedding planner from Charlotte, North Carolina, had everything she ever dreamed of. She lived in a bright, tasteful decorated apartment downtown and spent her days organizing events for high-profile clients. Her charm, creativity, and ability to stay calm under pressure made her one of the most sought-after planners in the area. She wasn't just building her career, she was building her future, and in her eyes, everything was falling perfectly into place. Her fiancé, Jake Hamilton, was 30, with a calm presence and sharp intellect that balanced Sarah's vibrant energy. He worked in tech consulting and had recently begun taking on private contracts, earning significantly more than he had just a year ago. His father had passed away unexpectedly 6 months prior, leaving behind a substantial family trust. Jake's inheritance was no secret. Friends, family, and even Sarah knew he was now worth millions. Their relationship, already solid, began gaining even more attention as they planned an extravagant wedding. Their social media was filled with matching outfits, gourmet dinners, and destination photo shoots. To anyone scrolling, they looked like the perfect match. But behind the smiles, filters, and glowing captions, there were subtle changes. Jake had started pulling back on spending, expressing concern over how quickly their wedding expenses were rising. Sarah, on the other hand, had grown increasingly fixated on the idea of security, financial and emotional. She began insisting on controlling the guest list, making decisions without Jake's input, and quietly pushing for the prenuptial agreement to be postponed. Jake, ever reasonable, didn't suspect anything malicious, thought she was simply overwhelmed by stress. To the world, they remained a golden couple. They hosted weekend parties, post-engagement countdowns, and regularly shared love notes online. Sarah's followers admired her for finding success and love at a young age. Brides in the city reached out for her services, believing she was living proof that dream weddings led to dream lives. But Sarah's mind was elsewhere. With Jake's money now secure in his name and their wedding weeks away, she began quietly searching online for something darker than cake designs and floral arrangements. There were no warning signs, at least none loud enough to cause alarm. Jake, always trusting, had no idea what Sarah was plotting. They had dinner together most nights, talked about their future, and even picked out names for their future children. But Sarah had started to act differently when she was alone. Her search history turned from venue ideas to methods of poisoning that wouldn't leave a trace. She began reading obscure articles on toxins, particularly substances that tasted sweet enough to hide in drinks. She wasn't rushing. She was patient, calm, and methodical. She convinced herself it wasn't real, just thoughts, just curiosity. But it was real. With every quiet night, every kiss on the cheek, and every toast raised to forever, Sarah's plan edged closer to becoming something irreversible. She told herself it was about freedom, about escaping a life where she'd always be second to someone else's legacy. She didn't want a divorce later. She wanted it all now, and without the man she was about to marry. And no one, not Jake, not their friends, not even her own reflection, could see what she was truly becoming. One evening, after a romantic dinner Sarah cooked at home, Jake collapsed. It was supposed to be a quiet night in, the kind they both enjoyed, a homemade meal, soft music playing in the background, and a bottle of wine to celebrate another week crossed off the wedding countdown. The menu seemed simple enough: grilled salmon, sautéed vegetables, and a glass of white wine chilled just right. Jake complimented the food, as he always did, and everything felt normal until his body began to betray him. Within an hour of dinner, Jake complained of dizziness. Minutes later, he lost his balance and fell in the hallway. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was barely conscious. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors scrambled to stabilize him. His symptoms were erratic blurred vision, slurred speech, and violent convulsions. At first, medical staff suspected a stroke, but tests showed no signs of brain bleeding. His kidneys were beginning to fail, and that's when toxicologists were called in. After extensive testing, they found something unexpected: traces of ethylene glycol in his system. It's a chemical found in antifreeze, deadly in small doses if not treated immediately. Luckily for Jake, doctors had caught it early enough to save his life. They administered an antidote and placed him in intensive care for monitoring. For a man in peak health, the sudden poisoning made no sense. There were no household accidents, no exposure risks, no evidence pointing to an unintentional cause. Sarah was the picture of concern. She sat beside his hospital bed, updating friends and family, her hands trembling as she wrote long, emotional posts online. She cried when doctors explained the severity of the poison. She stayed overnight, brought him clean clothes, and called his mother with calm reassurance. To everyone around her, she was a loving fiancée terrified for her partner's life. But the toxicology report told a different story. Someone had slipped a slow, sweet-tasting poison into Jake's system, and the timing was suspicious. Only 2 days before Jake's collapse, Sarah had been browsing obscure forums about undetectable toxins. She had visited pages discussing sweet poisons, ones that could be hidden easily in drinks or food. Her search history wasn't public, and her demeanor in the hospital gave no cause for suspicion. But the signs were already forming beneath the surface. She knew what she was doing. She had chosen a substance known to be hard to detect in small doses, a poison that slowly shut down internal organs before most victims even realized something was wrong. Jake didn't remember much about that night. The last thing he recalled was drinking wine and talking about honeymoon options. When he awoke in the hospital, confused and weak, Sarah held his hand and whispered that everything would be okay. He believed her, he trusted her, and for the moment, so did everyone else. But the incident didn't fade from memory. Doctors had questions. Poisonings like this didn't happen by accident. Jake's recovery began, but so did a quiet investigation that would eventually peel back the perfect image Sarah had so carefully crafted. For now, she had gotten away with it, but she had made one critical mistake. Jake survived. Jake's younger sister, Emily, was the first to sense something wrong. She had never fully trusted Sarah, though she kept her opinions to herself for the sake of her brother's happiness. Sarah had always seemed too polished, too controlled, as if she were performing for an audience that only she could see. When Jake was hospitalized, Emily was devastated, but something didn't sit right. The doctors had diagnosed it as poisoning, yet no one was treating it like a crime. It was written off as an anomalous, strange, unexplained, and possibly accidental. But Emily didn't believe in coincidences, not when it came to her brother's life. Sarah's reaction at the hospital only made her more suspicious. The tears, the over-explaining, the constant need to update social media felt excessive. It wasn't concern, it was theater. Emily started paying closer attention, watching Sarah's every move. She noticed inconsistencies, details that didn't add up. Sarah claimed Jake drank too much wine, but the hospital had ruled out alcohol poisoning. She said she made a light meal, but the toxicologist's report didn't point to anything in the food itself. What stood out most was the fact that Sarah never once asked what the doctors had found. She never asked about the cause, just the recovery. It was as if she already knew what had gone wrong. Unable to shake her instincts, Emily decided to dig deeper. She quietly hired a private investigator with experience in digital forensics. It didn't take long for him to uncover a trail. Sarah had placed online orders under a fake name, using an old email address connected to a forgotten beauty blog she once ran. Several of the items she purchased weren't related to wedding planning at all. One was a how-to guide on discreet poisoning methods. Another was a chemical handbook detailing fatal doses of household substances. The most alarming purchase was a set of small bottles labeled Pet Safety Esser, a product known to contain diluted ethylene glycol. Sarah had also been researching more than just poisons. She visited offshore banking websites, opened a new digital wallet under her maiden name, and transferred several $1,000s from a joint savings account she shared with Jake. None of this made sense if she was planning a future with him, but it made perfect sense if she was planning a future without him. While Emily was collecting evidence, Jake began to feel sick again. This time it happened after Sarah brought him a smoothie during one of her hospital visits. He had been getting stronger, but within hours of drinking it, his symptoms returned. His heart rate dropped, and his kidneys began to strain once more. The doctors ran another toxicology panel, and the results were unmistakable. Ethylene glycol was back. In higher concentration, it was no longer a mystery. Someone was actively poisoning him again. Emily took the findings from the investigator to the police, who began a discreet inquiry. They didn't alert Sarah, but they started gathering digital data, bank records, and surveillance footage. A pattern emerged. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a plan, and the person behind it wasn't slipping. It was calculated. Sarah had crossed the line from suspicious to dangerous. She just didn't know yet that someone was closing in. Police began building their case quietly. They didn't want to alarm Sarah or disrupt the pattern she had unknowingly set in motion. They worked in the background, pulling together threads of evidence that were beginning to form a clear picture. With the toxicology results from both hospitalizations, they had medical proof that Jake had been poisoned twice. Now, they needed to prove who had done it and how. Investigators accessed Sarah's internet history, which had been partially deleted. Using forensic tools, they recovered search terms related to antifreeze poisoning, undetectable toxins, and even threads from forums where users discuss how to get away with it. They found more than just searches. In her cloud backups, Sarah had saved a file titled "To Do Before the Wedding." Among typical planning items, like book hairstylist and confirm seating chart, there was a cryptic note that read, "Clean storage, hide meds, move savings." Investigators flagged it immediately. It didn't point directly to a crime, but it hinted at concealment. They also traced her fake email account and tracked the shipping address used for the pet de-esser bottles. It led them to a P.O. box Sarah had rented under her middle name 3 towns over. Security footage from the post office showed Sarah collecting the packages in disguise a baseball cap and sunglasses. She had thought she was being careful. Instead, she was building a trail. The investigators then turned their focus to Sarah's financial records. They discovered several recent transfers from Jake's savings account to one Sarah had opened in her maiden name just 2 weeks before his first collapse. A larger transfer was scheduled for the upcoming weekend over $20,000. It was set to go into an international cryptocurrency wallet that couldn't be traced beyond the initial deposit. The timing wasn't random. It coincided with the couple's final wedding dress, fitting, and rehearsal dinner. Sarah was tying up every loose end, not just for the wedding, but for her exit plan. Detectives moved to obtain surveillance footage from local hardware and convenience stores. At one small auto shop on the outskirts of the city, Sarah had been recorded purchasing a bottle of concentrated antifreeze in cash. She wore a scarf over her hair and avoided looking at the camera, but her license plate was visible when she left. With that, authorities had direct proof she had purchased the same substance found in Jake's system. The case was ready. When the police arrived at Sarah's apartment, she was preparing a weekend bag, likely for her bachelorette getaway. She didn't see it coming. In her purse, officers found a vial wrapped in paper towel, labeled in fine print with the chemical formula for ethylene glycol. It was the same brand found in Jake's lab tests. Her laptop, also confiscated at the scene, still had open tabs researching inheritance law without marriage and life insurance claims before wedding. Sarah was arrested on the spot. As she was escorted out of the apartment, neighbors stood frowning, shocked. To them, she was the sweet, organized bride to be with the dream job and the perfect fiancé. But behind the carefully curated life, there was a different reality, one filled with lies, deception, and a slow-moving plan that might have worked if only Jake hadn't survived the first dose. In court, Sarah claimed innocence and said Jake had drinking problems. Her legal team painted her as a loving fiancé caught in a tragic misunderstanding, insisting that the poison could have come from a contaminated bottle or accidental ingestion. They tried to shift blame toward stress, relationship strain, and Jake's supposed carelessness with supplements and health drinks, but the prosecution came prepared. They presented the full timeline, showing Sarah's repeated purchases of antifreeze, her disguised visits to the post office, and the digital evidence of her search history and deleted files. Each piece was small on its own, but together, it told a chilling story of premeditation. The most damning evidence came from Sarah's own devices. Prosecutors revealed messages and notes where she described Jake's inheritance and her frustration with his hesitance to spend it. They showed her transfer history, including attempts to hide money in digital wallets and offshore accounts. They even uncovered a drafted letter addressed to Jake's bank, requesting a full beneficiary update listing Sarah's name alone. Though the letter was never sent, it was enough to prove intent. Testimony from Jake's doctors added more weight. They explained how ethylene glycol enters the bloodstream and causes organ failure, particularly the kidneys and brain. Both poisonings had nearly identical chemical signatures, with doses increasing the second time. This wasn't an accident. They explained it was calculated escalation. The goal had been clear: kill Jake slowly enough that it looked like natural illness, then step into the life of a grieving fiancé turned inheritor. Jake Saturday silently through most of the trial, still recovering from both the physical trauma and the emotional betrayal. He had once trusted Sarah with everything. She had planned their future, picked out their wedding rings, and shared his dreams. To see her on the other side of the courtroom, avoiding eye contact, surrounded by defense attorneys, was something he never imagined. He later told reporters that the hardest part wasn't surviving the poison, it was accepting that the person who nearly killed him had once claimed to love him. The jury deliberated for less than a day. With overwhelming evidence, they returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of attempted murder, identity fraud, and premeditated poisoning. The judge sentenced Sarah to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of early parole. She stood still as the sentence was read, showing no emotion. There were no tears this time, no trembling hands, no social media posts begging for sympathy. The mask had finally fallen. Jake eventually made a full physical recovery. He cut off all communication with Sarah, closed their shared accounts, and quietly moved out of their apartment. He returned to work several months later and kept a low profile, choosing not to speak publicly, except for one brief interview where he thanked the doctors, police, and his sister Emily for saving his life. His sentinel understood how easily danger could hide behind a familiar face. Emily, who had never stopped fighting for the truth, later wrote a blog post titled "She Almost Got Away with It," which went viral. She used it to share signs of silent abuse and hidden manipulation, hoping to help others spot warning signs before it's too late. The story ended with justice, not before coming terrifyingly close to a perfect crime.